What if the person you trusted most, the one who stood at the pulpit every Sunday, who counseled you through your darkest moments, who baptized your children, suddenly vanished without a single word? In 2004, that's exactly what happened in Chattanooga, Tennessee, when Reverend David Mitchell, a beloved pastor and pillar of the community, disappeared without a trace after a routine Wednesday evening service. For 20 years, his family searched for answers. His congregation prayed for his return. His son abandoned his faith entirely, unable to reconcile a loving God with such inexplicable loss. Then, in 2024, construction workers breaking ground for a new community center made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden beneath the church property, buried for 2 decades, was evidence so damning it would expose a conspiracy of greed, betrayal, and murder that reached into the highest levels of church leadership. The arrest that followed didn't just shock the community. It shattered everything they thought they knew about faith, trust, and the men they'd called their spiritual fathers. This is the story of a cold case that refused to stay buried, of a son's relentless pursuit of truth, and of how modern forensics finally brought justice to a crime that powerful men thought they'd gotten away with. This is the Chattanooga cold case that proved no secret stays hidden forever. Let me introduce you to Reverend David Mitchell. 42 years old in 2004, David was more than just a pastor. He was the beating heart of the Riverside Baptist Church in Chattanooga's East Lake neighborhood. Those who knew him describe a man of unwavering principle, someone whose faith wasn't just preached from a pulpit but lived out in every interaction, every decision, every moment of his life. David grew up in nearby Cleveland, Tennessee, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher. He wasn't born into privilege or handed opportunities on a silver platter. He worked construction jobs to put himself through seminary, studying late into the night after 10-hour shifts laying foundation and framing houses. His hands bore the calluses of hard labor even after he took up the pastor's robe, and he was proud of that. He'd say, "Jesus was a carpenter. If it was good enough for him, it's good enough for me." In 1995, David accepted the call to lead Riverside Baptist, a small but growing congregation that had struggled to find consistent leadership. Under his guidance, the church flourished. Membership doubled within 5 years. But more importantly, the church became known throughout Chattanooga as a place of genuine community service. Running food pantries, offering free GED classes, hosting support groups for families dealing with addiction and incarceration. David had a particular passion for youth ministry. Every Thursday evening, he'd open the church gymnasium for what he called Hoops and Hope, a basketball program for at-risk teenagers that combined athletic mentorship with life skills training. Former participants remember him not as some distant authority figure, but as someone who genuinely cared. He knew their names, asked about their struggles at school, showed up at their games and graduations. One young man, now a teacher himself, recalls David bailing him out of juvenile detention and spending the entire night talking with him about choices, consequences, and second chances. David was married to his high school sweetheart, Patricia, for 20 years. They had 2 children, a daughter, Melissa, who was 16 in 2004, and a son, James, who was 19 and home from his first year at the University of Tennessee. Patricia worked as a nurse at Erlanger Hospital, often taking night shifts. The family lived modestly in a 3-bedroom house 2 miles from the church, the same house they'd bought when they first arrived in Chattanooga. Those who knew David described someone intensely devoted to his family, despite the demanding nature of pastoral work. He never missed Melissa's choir concerts. He'd take James fishing at Chickamauga Lake whenever his son came home from college. Sunday afternoons were sacred family time. No church business, no counseling sessions, just the 4 of them together. But David's defining characteristic, the quality everyone mentions first, was his fierce commitment to honesty and transparency. He preached about it constantly. The truth, he'd say, isn't always comfortable, but it's always necessary. A church built on anything less than absolute truth is a church built on sand, and the first storm will wash it away. Those words, spoken from the pulpit dozens of times, would take on a haunting significance after his disappearance. In his final sermon, delivered on Sunday, October 10, 2004, David spoke about accountability and stewardship. He told his congregation that leaders, especially church leaders, had a sacred responsibility to be above reproach in all matters, particularly when it came to finances and the trust placed in them by their community. Several people remember thinking the sermon seemed unusually pointed, more confrontational than David's typical style. One deacon later recalled feeling uncomfortable, wondering if David was addressing something specific, some problem brewing beneath the surface. 3 days later, David Mitchell would vanish, and that sermon would become the last words his congregation would ever hear from him. October 13, 2004. A Wednesday evening, Riverside Baptist Church held its weekly service at 7 p.m., a smaller, more intimate gathering than Sunday mornings. About 60 people attended that night. David led the worship, delivered a brief message about perseverance through trials, and closed with prayer at 8:15 p.m. Nothing seemed unusual. David was his typical self, warm, engaging, shaking hands and exchanging brief conversations with congregants as they filed out. The church secretary, Ellen Bradshaw, remembers him stopping to encourage a young couple going through marital difficulties, spending nearly 20 minutes with them in the sanctuary after everyone else had left. Ellen was finishing up administrative work in the church office when David finally walked the couple to their car around 8:45 p.m. That's when things get murky. Ellen says David returned to the building briefly, poking his head into the office to tell her good night and reminding her to lock up when she left. She remembers him mentioning he needed to stop by the church offices, a separate building about 50 yards from the main sanctuary, to grab some financial documents he wanted to review at home. Ellen thought nothing of it. David was meticulous about church finances, often taking ledgers and bank statements home to reconcile accounts personally. Ellen left the church around 9 p.m. David's car, a 2002 Honda Accord, was still parked in its usual spot near the church offices. She assumed he was still working. It wasn't unusual for David to stay late, especially on nights when Patricia was working the night shift at the hospital. David Mitchell was never seen alive again. The first alarm came the next morning. Thursday was David's day for hospital visits, rounds he made religiously every week to see sick and elderly church members at local medical facilities. He had 5 visits scheduled, starting at 9 a.m. When he didn't show up for the first one and didn't answer his cell phone, the patient's family called the church. Ellen tried calling him repeatedly. Nothing. By 10 a.m., she was worried. By 11, she was calling Patricia at home. Patricia had worked the night shift and come home around 7:30 a.m., assuming David had already left for his hospital rounds. She'd been asleep and hadn't realized he never came home the night before. When Ellen called, the first tendrils of panic began to set in. Patricia immediately called David's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She called James at college. Had his father mentioned anything unusual, any reason he might have gone somewhere unexpected? Nothing. By noon, Patricia drove to the church. David's car was still there, parked in the exact spot Ellen had seen it the night before. The church offices were locked. Patricia had a key. When she opened the door, everything appeared normal at first glance. Desk neat, computer off, papers stacked in organized piles. But then she noticed David's briefcase sitting on the floor next to his desk, right where he always left it. His keys were on the desk. His wallet was in the briefcase. His cell phone was there too, powered off. Think about that for a moment. A man doesn't leave his car, his keys, his wallet, and his cell phone behind if he's planning to go anywhere voluntarily. This wasn't someone running away. This was someone who'd been in that office and then disappeared. Patricia called the police at 12:30 p.m. Chattanooga Police Department responded quickly, sending 2 officers to the scene within 20 minutes. They did a preliminary search of the church grounds, checked the sanctuary, the offices, the fellowship hall, the gymnasium. No sign of David. No sign of struggle. No blood, no forced entry, nothing obviously out of place. But there was something. In David's office, on his desk, was a ledger book, the kind accountants use for manual record keeping. It was open to a page dated September 2004. The page showed church income and expenses, but someone had made handwritten notes in the margins. The notes were in David's distinctive handwriting, Discrepancy? Check deposit records. Where did $12,000 go? Ask Harold about building fund transfers. The detective who responded, a veteran named Robert Dawson, later said that ledger was the first hint that David's disappearance might not be a simple missing person case. But at the time, with no body, no crime scene, and no clear evidence of foul play, there wasn't much police could do beyond file a missing person report and hope David turned up with a reasonable explanation. The first 48 hours passed. Then the first week. David Mitchell had evaporated like morning mist, leaving behind a family in anguish, a congregation in confusion, and investigators with more questions than answers. Where was he? Why had he left everything behind? And what did those mysterious notes about missing money mean? Within days, the whispers started. You know how it is in a close-knit community. When something inexplicable happens, people create explanations to fill the void. Some said David had been having a nervous breakdown, that the stress of pastoral life had finally broken him and he'd wandered off in a fugue state. Others speculated about a secret life. Maybe gambling debts, maybe an affair, maybe some hidden shame that drove him to disappear voluntarily. But those who actually knew David, who'd seen him just hours before he vanished, rejected those theories completely. This was a man who lived transparently, who preached accountability, who'd never given anyone reason to doubt his integrity. Whatever happened to David Mitchell, it wasn't something he chose. The investigation continued for weeks, then months. Police interviewed everyone who'd been at the church that Wednesday evening. They combed through David's financial records, phone logs, email accounts. They found nothing suspicious, no hidden debts, no secret communications, no evidence of anything except a man living exactly the life he appeared to be living. Devoted pastor, loving father, honest leader. By the end of 2004, the case had hit a wall. Detectives had no leads, no suspects, no crime scene, and increasingly, no hope of finding David Mitchell alive. The case file was quietly moved to the cold case division, where it would sit, gathering dust, for the next 2 decades. But the story was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. Detective Robert Dawson wasn't ready to let go. Even as the case officially went cold, even as his superiors reassigned him to active investigations, Dawson kept coming back to those marginal notes in David Mitchell's ledger. Where did $12,000 go? Ask Harold about building fund transfers. Something about those words nagged at him, kept him up at night. Harold Griggs was the church treasurer, a position he'd held since 1998. 61 years old in 2004, Harold was a respected figure at Riverside Baptist. A deacon, a Sunday school teacher, a man who'd served the church faithfully for decades. He owned a small accounting firm in Chattanooga and handled the church's books as a volunteer service. On paper, Harold was above reproach. Dawson interviewed Harold 3 times in the weeks following David's disappearance. Each time, Harold expressed shock and concern. Yes, he'd been working with David on church finances. No, there were no serious problems, just some minor accounting discrepancies, the kind of small errors that happen in any organization. David had been thorough, perhaps overly so, but Harold assured detectives that everything was in order. The building fund transfers David had questioned? Just routine movements of money between accounts, all properly documented and approved by the church board. Dawson wanted to dig deeper, but without evidence of a crime, without even proof that David was dead rather than missing, there wasn't legal justification for forensic audits or search warrants. Harold's accounting records appeared clean on the surface. The church board backed him up. Yes, Harold had been moving money between accounts, but it was all legitimate church business, all properly authorized. Dawson's hands were tied. Remember that detail. Remember that when someone appears trustworthy, when their reputation is solid, when they have the backing of community leaders, it becomes incredibly difficult to investigate them, even when red flags are waving. Authority and trust can be shields that hide terrible secrets. The investigation explored other angles. Was David's disappearance connected to his youth ministry work? Had he gotten involved with a troubled teenager's family situation that turned violent? Detectives looked into it. Nothing. Had there been threats against him? Any conflicts with congregation members? Any disputes in the community? They checked every lead. Dead ends, all of them. One theory that gained traction was that David had witnessed something criminal, maybe a drug deal, maybe gang activity, near the church that Wednesday evening and had been killed to silence him. East Lake wasn't the roughest neighborhood in Chattanooga, but it wasn't crime-free either. Detectives canvassed the area, talked to street informants, looked for any reports of violence or suspicious activity on October 13th. They found nothing concrete. The most heartbreaking part of those early investigation months was watching David's family disintegrate under the weight of not knowing. Patricia held it together through sheer force of will, continuing to work her nursing shifts, keeping the household running, clinging to hope that David would come home. But you could see it eating her alive, the uncertainty, the absence of closure. How do you mourn someone when you don't know if they're dead? How do you move forward when there's always that sliver of possibility that tomorrow might bring answers? Melissa, their 16-year-old daughter, withdrew into herself. Her grades plummeted. She stopped singing in the church choir, stopped attending services altogether. Friends reported that she'd become quiet, distant, going through the motions of daily life like a ghost. Years later, she'd say that her father's disappearance didn't just take him away. It took away her sense that the world made sense, that good people were protected, that faith meant something. And then there was James, 19 years old, home from college indefinitely because how could he focus on classes when his father was missing? James threw himself into the search with ferocious intensity. He printed thousands of flyers, organized volunteer search parties, created a website dedicated to finding David. He appeared on local news broadcasts pleading for information. He walked every street in East Lake, knocked on doors, asked questions, refused to accept that his father could just vanish. But as weeks turned into months, something hardened inside James. The faith that had been central to his life, the faith his father had nurtured so carefully, began to crack. He'd pray every night for answers, for his father's return, for just some sign that God was listening. Silence. Nothing but silence. James started asking harder questions. If God was real, if God was good, if God had any power at all, how could he allow this? How could a man who'd devoted his entire life to serving others simply disappear without a trace? By spring of 2005, James had stopped praying altogether. He'd returned to college that fall, but he'd never set foot in a church again. Not for weddings, not for funerals, not for any reason. He'd say later that watching his mother cling to faith while her husband's absence slowly destroyed her was more than he could bear. Faith, to James, became synonymous with false hope, with wasted energy, with a cosmic cruelty that demanded devotion without offering anything in return. Detective Dawson kept working the case on his own time, but leads were evaporating. The 1-year anniversary came and went. Then the 2-year mark. David Mitchell's disappearance became one of those tragic mysteries that haunt communities. Everyone knows the story, everyone has theories, but no one has answers. The investigation had identified 3 potential scenarios. 1. David had left voluntarily for reasons no one understood, and was somewhere living a different life. Detectives found this unlikely given the evidence, but couldn't rule it out completely. 2. David had encountered random violence that Wednesday evening and his body had been disposed of in a way that prevented discovery. Possible, but there was zero forensic evidence to support it. 3. David's disappearance was connected to those notes about missing church money, which suggested someone with access to the church had a motive to silence him. That 3rd scenario was what kept Dawson up at night. But without a body, without a crime scene, without any concrete evidence connecting Harold Griggs or anyone else to David's disappearance, there was nothing to prosecute. The case went cold not because investigators gave up, but because they'd exhausted every investigative avenue available to them with the evidence they had. By 2007, the case file was buried in archives. By 2010, most people in Chattanooga had moved on, remembered David Mitchell as a sad story but not an active mystery. The church had hired a new pastor. Life continued. Only a few people, Patricia, James, Melissa, and Detective Dawson, who'd retired in 2012, still actively thought about what happened that October evening. Justice, it seemed, would never come. The truth would remain buried, literally and figuratively. Harold Griggs continued his respected position as church treasurer, eventually retiring with honors in 2015. The secret, if there was one, appeared safe forever. But secrets, as we're about to see, have a way of clawing their way back to the surface, no matter how deep you bury them. 20 years. 2 full decades. Think about how much life happens in 20 years. Children grow into adults. Adults grow old. Technology transforms. Entire generations come of age never knowing a world without smartphones, without social media, without instant access to every piece of information imaginable. The world of 2004 feels ancient compared to 2024. But for the Mitchell family, time moved differently. Time was measured in birthdays David never saw, in holidays he wasn't there to celebrate, in milestones he missed. Melissa graduated high school without her father in the audience. She got married in 2012, walked down the aisle alone because the man who should have been there had vanished 8 years earlier. She had 2 children, David's grandchildren, who would never meet the grandfather they were named after. Patricia remained in the same house, kept David's study exactly as he'd left it. His books still lined the shelves, his sermon notes still sat in neat stacks on the desk, his reading glasses still waited on the nightstand. Friends gently suggested that maybe it was time to move on, to pack things up, to accept that David wasn't coming back. Patricia would smile politely and change the subject. She couldn't let go. Letting go meant accepting that she'd never know what happened, and that was unacceptable. She kept working at Erlanger Hospital until her retirement in 2018, continued attending Riverside Baptist Church even though every Sunday was a reminder of what she'd lost. Church members admired her strength, her faithfulness, her ability to carry on despite unimaginable grief. What they didn't see were the private moments, the nights she'd wake up reaching for a husband who wasn't there, the times she'd set the table for 2 before remembering, the way she'd pause whenever a tall man with David's build walked past. James's path was different, darker. He finished college, got a degree in social work, spent his 20s working with at-risk youth in Atlanta, the same kind of kids his father had mentored, though James would never consciously acknowledge the connection. He was good at his job, genuinely helped people, but there was a hollowness to it. He was going through the motions of caring, of making a difference, while internally feeling nothing but anger. Anger at his father for disappearing. Anger at the police for not finding him. Anger at God, if God existed, for allowing injustice to stand unchallenged. Anger at himself for not being able to let it go and move on. That anger, calcified over the years, became a defining part of who James was. Friends learned not to bring up anything related to faith or religion around him. Romantic relationships never lasted because he couldn't let anyone close enough to see how broken he really was. Every year on October 13th, James would take the day off work, drive to Chattanooga, and stand outside Riverside Baptist Church. He never went inside. That was a line he wouldn't cross. But he'd stand there for hours, staring at the building where his father had last been seen, willing the bricks and mortar to give up their secrets. They never did. Melissa tried to maintain a relationship with her brother, but it was hard. She'd found a way to move forward, had built a life that wasn't defined by their father's disappearance. She'd made peace with not knowing, had accepted that some questions don't have answers. But James couldn't do that. His inability to let go, his consuming bitterness, created a wall between them. They'd talk on holidays, exchange brief emails, but the closeness they'd had as kids was gone. Meanwhile, in a development neither the family nor the community knew about, Detective Robert Dawson hadn't actually let go either. Retired from active duty, living on his police pension, Dawson spent hours each week in his home office reviewing cold case files. David Mitchell's case was always on top of the stack. Dawson had digitized everything, all the original reports, all the interview transcripts, all the evidence logs. He'd created a detailed timeline, mapping out every known movement of every person who'd been at or near the church on October 13, 2004. Dawson had a theory he'd never been able to prove. David had discovered embezzlement, had confronted the wrong person, and had been killed to protect the secret. Harold Griggs was still his prime suspect, but without evidence it remained just a theory. Dawson would spend his retirement years periodically reaching out to the Chattanooga Police Department's cold case unit, asking if they'd be willing to take a fresh look at the Mitchell file. The answer was always the same: we'd love to, but without new evidence, there's nothing to investigate. New evidence. That was the key phrase. Without something concrete to push the case forward, David Mitchell's disappearance would remain an unsolved mystery forever. The case needed a break, a discovery, something that would force investigators to reopen what had been closed for so long. And in 2024, 20 years almost to the day after David vanished, that's exactly what happened. But the break wouldn't come from traditional investigative work. It wouldn't come from a witness finally coming forward or from someone's guilty conscience catching up with them. It would come from construction workers with shovels, breaking ground on a community center that was supposed to bring hope and renewal to East Lake. Instead, those shovels would unearth evidence of a crime so calculated, so cold-blooded, that it would shatter everything the community thought they knew about the people they'd trusted for decades. The truth was about to claw its way out of the earth, and when it did, it would bring justice, devastation, and a reckoning that was 20 years overdue. October 7th, 2024. A Monday morning. Construction crews arrived at the plot of land adjacent to Riverside Baptist Church to begin work on the East Lake Community and Wellness Center, a project years in the making. The center was going to be a major addition to the neighborhood: gym facilities, computer labs, counseling offices, meeting spaces. Funding had come from a combination of city grants and private donations. Riverside Baptist had donated the land, a gesture seen as continuing David Mitchell's legacy of community service, even though he'd been gone for 2 decades. The construction crew, employees of Chattanooga-based Ridgeline Construction, started with site preparation. That meant clearing vegetation, removing old foundation remnants from buildings that had once occupied the space, and excavating to establish proper grade levels. Around 10:30 a.m., a backhoe operator named Marcus Webb was digging near the property line between the church offices and the new construction site when his bucket hit something that wasn't dirt. At first, Marcus thought he'd struck an old water line or electrical conduit. He stopped the backhoe, climbed down, and peered into the trench his machine had opened. What he saw made his blood run cold. Partially exposed in the disturbed soil was what appeared to be a large plastic storage container, the kind you'd buy at a home improvement store for organizing garage tools. But this container was buried. Who buries a storage container 4 feet underground? Marcus called over his foreman, Tony Rodriguez. Together, they carefully excavated around the container by hand. It was approximately 2 feet long, 18 inches wide, maybe a foot deep. It was sealed with duct tape that had deteriorated significantly but was still partially intact. The plastic itself was cracked and dirt-stained, but recognizable as a once-clear storage bin. Tony, who'd been in construction for 30 years and had seen his share of strange discoveries, knew immediately this needed to be reported. They didn't open the container. That's important. They didn't disturb it beyond what was necessary to fully expose it. Tony Rodriguez called the site supervisor, who called the project manager, who called the Chattanooga Police Department. Within 45 minutes, patrol officers were on scene. Within 2 hours, detectives from the Major Crimes Unit had arrived, along with forensic technicians. The area was cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape. Construction halted immediately. Workers stood around in clusters, speculating about what had been found. Some thought it might be hazardous materials illegally dumped. Others joked nervously about buried treasure or time capsules. A few of the older workers, the ones who remembered the David Mitchell case, felt a creeping sense of dread. Something buried this deliberately, this close to where a pastor had vanished, probably wasn't anything good. Detective Sarah Chun, a 14-year veteran of the CPD who'd been assigned to the cold case unit for the past 3 years, took charge of the scene. Chun had actually reviewed the David Mitchell file just months earlier as part of a systematic cold case audit. She'd read about his disappearance, about the notes concerning missing money, about the investigation that had gone nowhere. She'd flagged it as a case worth revisiting if resources became available. Now, standing over an excavated burial site on church property, Chun felt every instinct screaming that this discovery was connected. The storage container was carefully removed from the ground, photographed extensively in situ, then transported to the police forensics lab. The decision was made to open it under controlled conditions with proper documentation and evidence handling protocols. If this turned out to be connected to a crime, and Chen's gut said it was, they couldn't afford any mistakes that might compromise prosecution later. That evening, in the sterile environment of the forensics lab, with multiple cameras recording and 3 forensic technicians present, Detective Chun carefully cut through the deteriorated duct tape and opened the container. Inside, wrapped in what had once been a black plastic trash bag, were items that immediately confirmed this was no random burial. First, a leather Bible. Even after 20 years underground, even damaged by moisture and soil, the gold embossing on the cover was still partially visible. It read, "Presented to Reverend David Mitchell on his ordination day, June 12, 1988. Chen's pulse quickened. They'd found something connected to David. After 2 decades, they'd finally found something. But the Bible wasn't all. Beneath it, also wrapped in plastic, was a pastor's robe, the kind worn during Sunday services. The robe was dark blue, traditional cut, monogrammed on the inside collar with the initials DM. It was stained with what appeared to be dark brown patches that forensic techs would later confirm was blood. Blood. David Mitchell's robe, covered in blood, buried 4 feet underground on church property. This wasn't a missing person case anymore. This was a murder investigation. But there was more. At the bottom of the container, in a sealed Ziploc bag that had miraculously stayed relatively intact, was a small leather journal, the kind someone might use for personal notes or daily reflections. The journal was water-damaged, many pages illegible, but portions were still readable. Chun carefully opened it, her gloved hands turning pages with extreme care. The journal was filled with David Mitchell's handwriting, the same distinctive script from the ledger notes that had been found in his office 20 years earlier. The entries were dated from August through early October 2004, and they told a story that made everything suddenly horrifyingly clear. August 19, 2004. Discrepancies in building fund are larger than I initially thought. 12,000 is actually closer to 18. Need to trace where money went before bringing to church board. September 2, 2004. Confronted Harold today about transfers. He got defensive, said it was all legitimate expenses. Asked for documentation. He promised to provide it by next week but seemed nervous. Something isn't right. September 16, 2004. Harold provided paperwork, but it doesn't add up. Invoices from companies I can't verify actually exist. Need to dig deeper. Don't want to believe Harold capable of theft. But evidence is pointing that direction. October 1, 2004. Discovered second set of books in Harold's office files. Church board has no idea. Total missing money might be over 40,000 across 3 years. This is deliberate, systematic embezzlement. Must report to authorities. October 12, 2004. One day before David disappeared. Meeting with Harold tomorrow evening after service. Going to give him chance to explain, to make things right before I go to police. Praying for his soul. If he's stealing from church, he's stealing from God. And the consequences will be devastating. But giving him opportunity to confess and repent. That's what Christ would do. That was the last entry. David Mitchell had documented his discovery of embezzlement, his investigation, his intention to give Harold Griggs one final chance to come clean before involving law enforcement. And the day after writing that entry, David vanished. Now, 20 years later, his Bible, his robe, and his journal had been found buried on church property, containing evidence of a motive for murder. The case that had haunted Chattanooga for 2 decades suddenly had a clear narrative. David discovered financial crimes, confronted the perpetrator, and was killed to silence him. Detective Chun immediately called her captain. This wasn't just a cold case warming up. This was a full-blown homicide investigation with substantial new evidence. Within hours, the decision was made to reopen the David Mitchell case with full resources. The next step was obvious. They needed to find Harold Griggs and they needed to search that burial site more thoroughly. If they'd found David's belongings, his body might be nearby. The excavation expanded. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in. Cadaver dogs swept the area. And at 7:15 p.m., less than 12 hours after the initial discovery, the dogs alerted to a spot approximately 15 feet from where the storage container had been found. Investigators carefully excavated the area by hand. What they found, buried 5 feet deep in a grave that had been carefully filled and concealed, were human remains. Skeletal remains, decomposed after 20 years in the ground, but unmistakably human. A skull, spine, ribs, long bones, all present, all in anatomical position suggesting the body had been buried intact, not scattered or dismembered. And wrapped around the skeletal remains were the tattered fragments of clothing. A shirt, pants, shoes, consistent with what David Mitchell had been wearing the last time he was seen alive. David Mitchell had been found. After 20 years, after thousands of hours of searching, after his family had given up hope of ever knowing what happened, he'd been located less than 100 feet from where he'd last been seen alive, hidden on the very property where he devoted his life to serving others, buried by someone he'd trusted, someone he'd given a chance to confess and repent. The discovery sent shockwaves through Chattanooga. By the next morning, every local news station was covering the story. National media picked it up. Pastor's body found after 20 years, buried on church property. The case that had been forgotten by everyone except a grieving family and a retired detective was suddenly the biggest story in Tennessee. For Patricia Mitchell, now 69 years old, the news brought simultaneous relief and renewed anguish. Relief that David had been found, that she finally knew what happened, that the uncertainty was over. Anguish at the confirmation of what she'd always feared deep down, that her husband had been murdered, had died violently, had been buried like trash and left to rot while his killer walked free. For James, now 41, the discovery detonated like a bomb in his carefully constructed life. Everything he'd believed for 20 years, that his father was gone beyond finding, that justice was impossible, that the universe was fundamentally unfair and uncaring, suddenly shifted. There was evidence. There was a path to justice. The story wasn't over after all. And for Harold Griggs, now 83 years old, living in a comfortable retirement home in Chattanooga, enjoying the golden years built on 2 decades of hidden guilt, the discovery meant the secret he'd thought safely buried was about to destroy everything. The net was closing, and there was nowhere left to run. The forensic analysis moved quickly. DNA was extracted from the skeletal remains and compared against DNA samples from Patricia and James Mitchell. The results came back in 72 hours. Positive match with 99.9% certainty. The remains were definitively David Mitchell's. Cause of death was determined through skeletal analysis, blunt force trauma to the skull. 3 distinct impact sites suggested multiple strikes with a heavy object. David hadn't died quickly or peacefully. He'd been beaten to death. The journal entries provided clear motive and timeline. But journal entries alone wouldn't be enough to convict anyone. Detective Chun and her team needed physical evidence connecting Harold Griggs to the murder. They needed to prove that Harold not only had a motive but also the opportunity and means to kill David Mitchell, dispose of his body, and cover up the crime for 2 decades. The investigation moved on multiple fronts simultaneously. First, forensic accountants were brought in to examine Riverside Baptist Church's financial records from 2001 through 2004. What they discovered was exactly what David Mitchell had documented in his journal, systematic embezzlement totaling $47,000 over a 3-year period. The methodology was sophisticated for a small church but relatively simple in execution. Harold would create false invoices from fake vendors for church maintenance and building improvements, get the church board to approve payments, then deposit the checks into accounts he controlled. The embezzlement had actually continued after David's death. From 2005 through 2014, Harold had stolen an additional $93,000 using similar methods. The total theft from Riverside Baptist Church was approximately $140,000 over 13 years. Harold had only stopped when he retired as treasurer in 2015, presumably deciding he'd pushed his luck far enough and wanting to enjoy his ill-gotten gains in peace. Second, investigators executed search warrants on Harold Griggs's current residence, his storage units, and his former home. What they found was damning. In a storage unit Harold had rented continuously since 2003, buried in boxes of old financial records and personal papers, investigators discovered a second set of accounting books for Riverside Baptist Church, the same ones David had referenced in his journal. These books showed the actual movement of embezzled funds, tracking every fake invoice and fraudulent payment. Harold had kept meticulous records of his own theft, perhaps as insurance or perhaps simply out of accounting habit. But the real breakthrough came from forensic technology that hadn't existed in 2004. The plastic storage container that had held David's belongings was processed for fingerprints using modern chemical analysis techniques. Despite 20 years in the ground, despite deterioration and soil contamination, forensic techs were able to recover 3 partial fingerprints from the interior surface of the container. The prints were run through databases and matched to Harold Griggs. Think about what that means. Harold's fingerprints, inside a container that held items belonging to a murdered man, buried on church property. That physical evidence connected Harold directly to the disposal of evidence related to David's death. It wasn't proof of murder on its own, but combined with motive, timeline, and the journal entries, it was building an increasingly solid case. The investigation also uncovered something unexpected. Harold hadn't acted alone. Cell phone records from October 13, 2004, records that had been pulled during the original investigation but not thoroughly analyzed, showed multiple calls between Harold Griggs and another church elder, Thomas Keller, on the evening of David's disappearance. Keller, now 79, had served as church facilities manager in 2004, responsible for building maintenance and groundskeeping. He'd have had access to equipment for digging, for moving earth, for burying something on church property without arousing suspicion. Detective Chun brought Thomas Keller in for questioning. Initially, Keller denied everything. Hadn't seen David that night, hadn't been involved in anything criminal, had no idea what the detective was talking about. But Chun had done her homework. She laid out the evidence piece by piece. The phone calls, the burial location near facilities equipment storage, the physical impossibility of an 81-year-old man single-handedly burying a body 5 feet deep. She explained that forensic teams were currently processing the excavation site for additional evidence, and it was only a matter of time before they found something connecting Keller to the scene. Chun also explained the legal concept of accessory to murder versus being a co-conspirator. She made it clear that prosecutors would look more favorably on someone who cooperated, who told the truth, who showed remorse, compared to someone who stonewalled and forced the state to prove every element at trial. And finally, she mentioned that Harold Griggs was being picked up for questioning at that very moment. Whoever talked first, whoever cooperated, would be in a better position when charges were filed. That's when Thomas Keller broke. The weight of carrying a terrible secret for 20 years, the fear of spending whatever time he had left in prison, the moral burden that had eaten at him for 2 decades. It all came pouring out. He asked for an attorney, which was his right, but he also indicated willingness to cooperate in exchange for a plea agreement. What Keller described in his subsequent interviews, conducted with his attorney present, painted a picture of that October evening that was both horrifyingly brutal and tragically preventable. According to Keller, here's what happened. David Mitchell had confronted Harold Griggs on Wednesday evening, October 13, 2004, in the church offices after the evening service ended. Keller wasn't present for the initial confrontation but received a frantic phone call from Harold around 9 p.m. Harold said there was a serious problem and he needed help immediately. The 2 men had been friends for decades, had served together in church leadership, had covered for each other's mistakes over the years. Keller went to the church without asking too many questions. When Keller arrived, he found Harold in a state of panic. David was dead. Harold claimed it was an accident. David had confronted him about the embezzlement, had threatened to go to police, had said Harold would go to prison. An argument escalated. David moved toward the phone to call authorities. Harold picked up a heavy metal bookend from the desk and swung it to stop him. He hit David once in the head. David fell but was still moving, still trying to reach the phone. Harold panicked and hit him twice more. Then David stopped moving entirely. Keller said when he arrived, David's body was on the floor of Harold's office, blood pooling beneath his head. Harold was sobbing, saying he'd made a terrible mistake, saying he never meant to kill David, saying they had to do something. And Thomas Keller, faced with his friend's desperation, made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He agreed to help cover it up. They worked through the night. First, they stripped David's body of his clerical robe and removed his Bible from his briefcase. Items too distinctive to leave with the body. They wrapped these in plastic bags and sealed them in a storage container. Then they wrapped David's body in a tarp from the facility's storage shed. Using a church van, they moved the body to a location they'd selected on the far edge of church property, an area that was rarely accessed and heavily wooded. Thomas Keller, as facilities manager, had access to excavation equipment. Over the next 3 hours, he dug a grave 5 feet deep. They buried David, filled the grave, covered it with sod and leaves. Then they buried the storage container with his belongings about 15 feet away, close enough to be concealed in the same general area, but separate from the body itself. They cleaned the office thoroughly, mopped the floors, wiped down surfaces. By dawn, there was no obvious evidence that anything had occurred. Both men went home, showered, changed clothes, and went to work the next day as if nothing had happened. When David was reported missing, they expressed shock and concern along with everyone else. They watched the police investigation, heart rate spiking every time detectives asked questions. But the evidence was too well hidden. The secret held. And as months became years became decades, they convinced themselves they'd gotten away with it. The guilt never left. Keller admitted it had destroyed his peace, had poisoned his relationships, had left him unable to sleep through the night for 20 years. But he'd kept quiet. Until now. Keller's confession was corroborated by physical evidence and forensic analysis. The metal bookend he described as the murder weapon was gone. Harold had disposed of it immediately, but the injury pattern on David's skull was consistent with Keller's account of multiple strikes with a heavy, flat object. The timeline matched phone records and witness statements from the original investigation. Details about the burial location and methodology matched what excavators found. This wasn't a fabricated confession. This was someone finally telling the truth after years of living a lie. Armed with Keller's testimony and the accumulated physical evidence, prosecutors felt confident moving forward. On November 1, 2024, arrest warrants were issued for Harold Griggs and Thomas Keller. Both men were charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. Additional charges related to embezzlement were filed separately. The arrest of Harold Griggs was carried out at his residence on the morning of November 2nd. He was brought out of his home in handcuffs, 83 years old, looking frail and defeated. News cameras captured the moment. Neighbors who'd known Harold for years watched in disbelief as police loaded him into a squad car. This was a man who'd been a deacon, a respected community member, someone who'd attended church every Sunday for decades. And now he was being charged with murdering a pastor. Harold exercised his right to remain silent, declined to make any statements, and requested an attorney. Unlike Keller, he showed no remorse, no willingness to cooperate. His strategy appeared to be to fight the charges, to force prosecutors to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. It was his legal right, but it also meant no closure for the family, no full accounting of what happened, no explanation from the man most responsible. The community reaction was seismic. Riverside Baptist Church released a statement expressing shock and grief, pledging full cooperation with authorities, and offering support to the Mitchell family. Many church members felt betrayed. They trusted Harold, had believed in his integrity, had defended him when the original investigation raised questions. Now they had to confront the reality that someone they'd worshipped beside for years was a murderer and a thief. But the investigation wasn't over. Prosecutors were building their case for trial, and they were determined that after waiting 20 years for justice, they wouldn't let Harold Griggs slip through their fingers on technicalities or reasonable doubt. The cold case that had haunted Chattanooga was finally, definitively solved. Now came the hard part, making sure the legal system delivered the justice David Mitchell deserved. As the prosecution prepared for trial, they knew they needed more than Thomas Keller's confession to secure a conviction against Harold Griggs. Defense attorneys would argue that Keller was lying to reduce his own culpability, that he was the actual murderer trying to shift blame to Harold, that his testimony couldn't be trusted without independent corroboration. The prosecution needed forensic evidence that definitively tied Harold to the murder, evidence that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as coincidence. That evidence came from multiple sources, pieced together through months of meticulous forensic work. First, the murder weapon, or rather, the identification of what the murder weapon had been. The skull fractures on David Mitchell's remains showed a distinctive pattern, 3 separate impact sites, each approximately 2 inches wide, rectangular in shape, with characteristics suggesting a flat metal surface with a slight edge. Forensic investigators compared these characteristics against common objects that might be found in a church office in 2004. The pattern was consistent with several possibilities, but one stood out: a cast iron bookend. Further investigation revealed that Harold Griggs's office in 2004 had contained a pair of decorative cast iron bookends shaped like praying hands, items that multiple witnesses remembered seeing on his desk. After David's disappearance, those bookends were never seen again. Investigators tracked down a former church secretary who'd helped clear out Harold's office when he retired in 2015. She remembered asking about the praying hands bookends because they'd been distinctive pieces that had sat on Harold's desk for years. Harold told her he'd donated them to Goodwill. But when investigators checked with local Goodwill locations and searched donation records, no such items were ever logged. Harold had lied about what happened to objects that matched the murder weapon profile. That lie was significant. Second, the plastic storage container. Beyond Harold's fingerprints on the interior, forensic analysis revealed additional damning evidence. The container itself was a Rubbermaid action packer, a specific model sold at Home Depot and Lowe's. Investigators pulled purchase records from local stores for that model in October 2004. Credit card records showed that Harold Griggs had purchased 2 action packer containers from the Home Depot on Brainerd Road on October 14, 2004, the day after David disappeared. Harold's credit card records from that same shopping trip also showed purchases of heavy-duty trash bags, duct tape, and work gloves, each item consistent with materials needed to conceal evidence and handle a burial. The timing was impossible to explain away. The day after David vanished, the man who had the clearest motive to harm him purchased materials perfect for disposing of evidence. Third, the journal itself. Forensic document examiners confirmed the handwriting was definitely David Mitchell's, authenticated through comparison with known samples from sermons and personal letters. The paper and ink were analyzed and dated to 2004 based on chemical composition. This wasn't a forgery or a fabricated piece of evidence planted years later. It was a genuine contemporary document written by David in the weeks leading up to his death. But here's where it got even more interesting. Forensic analysts were able to enhance some of the water-damaged, previously illegible portions of the journal using infrared imaging and chemical treatments. These restored sections revealed additional details that strengthened the case against Harold. One entry from September 28, 2004, read, "Harold growing increasingly hostile when I press for documentation. Today he said, 'You need to let this go, David. You're making a mistake pursuing this. Some things are better left alone.' Is that a threat? Am I in danger?" David Mitchell had sensed the danger. In his final weeks, he'd recognized that pressing Harold on the embezzlement might put him at risk, but his commitment to truth and justice outweighed his fear. He'd continued investigating, continued demanding accountability, even when warned to back off. That courage had cost him his life. Fourth, and perhaps most compelling, was evidence that emerged from Harold's own electronic records. In 2004, email wasn't as ubiquitous as it would become, but Harold did have a personal email account he used for his accounting business. Prosecutors subpoenaed records from the email provider, records that had been preserved in server backups for 20 years. Among Harold's emails from October 2004 was a draft message, never sent, dated October 15, 2004, 2 days after David's disappearance. The email was addressed to no one, essentially a note to himself. It read, "Can't believe what I've done. Can't take it back. David gave me a chance to make it right and I killed him instead. God will never forgive me. But if I confess, prison. If I stay quiet, maybe I can live with this. have to stay quiet, have to forget, have to move on. That email was the smoking gun. A confession, written by Harold in a moment of panic and guilt, saved in his draft folder and forgotten about for 20 years. He'd never sent it, had probably forgotten it existed, but it was there, preserved, waiting, and now it would be used to convict him of murder. Defense attorneys fought desperately to have the email excluded as evidence. They argued it was taken out of context, that it was a hypothetical thought exercise, that it didn't prove Harold actually committed the murder. But the court ruled it admissible. Combined with all the other evidence, the journal, the purchases, the burial location, Keller's testimony, that email was devastating. The prosecution also brought in expert witnesses to reconstruct the crime. Forensic anthropologists explained the burial methodology and timeline. Financial forensics experts walked through the embezzlement scheme in detail, showing clear motive. Cell phone analysts mapped the communication between Harold and Thomas on the night of the murder. DNA experts confirmed the identity of the remains. Forensic pathologists described the cause of death and how it aligned with Keller's account. But perhaps the most emotionally powerful evidence was the simplest. David Mitchell's own words from his journal, read aloud in court. Meeting with Harold tomorrow evening after service. Going to give him chance to explain, to make things right before I go to police. Praying for his soul. If he's stealing from church, he's stealing from God. And the consequences will be devastating. But giving him opportunity to confess and repent. That's what Christ would do. David had given Harold a chance to confess, to repent, to make things right. He'd approached the confrontation with grace and mercy, offering a path to redemption even while holding Harold accountable. And Harold's response had been to kill him, to bury his body, and to spend the next 20 years living off stolen church funds while David's family suffered without answers. The defense's case was weak. They tried to argue that Thomas Keller was the actual killer, that Harold was being framed, that the evidence was circumstantial. They pointed out that no one had witnessed the murder itself, that everything depended on trusting Keller's testimony and interpreting forensic evidence in a particular way. They painted Harold as an old man being scapegoated for a crime he didn't commit. But the evidence was overwhelming. The timeline, the motive, the physical evidence, the financial records, the confession email, all of it pointed to one conclusion. Harold Griggs had murdered David Mitchell to cover up embezzlement, and Thomas Keller had helped him dispose of the body and conceal the crime. The prosecution's case was airtight. As the trial approached, one question lingered. Would Harold finally take responsibility? Would he confess, express remorse, offer the Mitchell family some measure of closure beyond just a legal conviction? Or would he maintain his silence, force the family to relive every detail in court, and go to his grave without acknowledging what he'd done? The answer would come in the courtroom, in front of the community he'd betrayed, under the weight of evidence he couldn't refute. Justice was coming for Harold Griggs. 20 years delayed, but no less certain. November 2nd, 2024, 6:15 a.m. A cold, gray morning in Chattanooga. Detective Sarah Chan and 4 uniformed officers approached the entrance of Riverview Senior Living, an upscale assisted living facility where Harold Griggs resided in a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment. The arrest had been carefully planned, early morning timing to minimize public spectacle, but not so early that Harold would still be asleep. They wanted him awake, aware, and conscious of what was happening. Chun knocked firmly on the door of apartment 3B. A long pause, then shuffling footsteps. The door opened to reveal Harold Griggs, 83 years old, wearing a bathrobe and slippers, looking confused and alarmed at the sight of police officers at his door at dawn. Harold Griggs, Chun said, her voice firm and official. Yes, what's this about? Harold's voice wavered, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of knowing, of the moment he'd probably feared for 20 years finally arriving. Harold Griggs, you're under arrest for the murder of David Mitchell. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights? Harold didn't respond immediately. He stood there, hand gripping the doorframe, his face cycling through emotions. Shock, fear, resignation. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed. Finally, barely audible, "I want a lawyer." "That's your right. Officers will escort you to get dressed. Then we'll transport you to police headquarters for booking. Please cooperate and this will go smoothly." Harold was led back into his apartment under police supervision, allowed to change into street clothes. Neighbors in the senior living facility, alerted by the commotion, peered out of their doors. Whispers spread quickly. By the time Harold was walked out in handcuffs, a small crowd had gathered. Other residents, facility staff, all watching in stunned silence as someone they'd known as a quiet, friendly neighbor was taken away accused of murder. The arrest made the morning news cycle immediately. By 7 a.m., video of Harold being placed in a police cruiser was playing on every local station. By 8 a.m., it had gone national. 83-year-old church treasurer arrested for murder of Tennessee pastor 20 years after victim disappeared. The story had every element media loves. A cold case solved, religious institution, elderly suspect, decades-long cover-up. The community reaction was immediate and visceral. At Riverside Baptist Church, the pastor who'd succeeded David Mitchell 2 decades ago held an emergency congregation meeting that evening. Over 200 people packed into the sanctuary, seeking answers, seeking comfort, seeking to understand how something so evil could have happened in their church, in their community, involving people they trusted. Some congregation members remembered Harold from before his retirement. They remembered him counting the offering, sitting in board meetings, teaching Sunday school. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. This was a man who'd prayed with them, who'd shared communion with them, who'd presented himself as a faithful servant of God. And all along he'd been a murderer, literally standing on the grave of the man he'd killed, attending services in the building where he'd committed the crime. For Patricia Mitchell, the arrest brought a complicated mixture of emotions. She'd waited 20 years for this moment, for someone to be held accountable for David's death. But seeing it actually happen, watching Harold Griggs in handcuffs on television, didn't bring the satisfaction she'd imagined. Instead, it brought fresh grief. This was real now. David was really dead, really murdered, really buried and forgotten while his killer walked free for 2 decades. The confirmation was almost as painful as the original loss. Patricia's daughter Melissa, now 38, was more unequivocally relieved. She'd built a life despite her father's disappearance. But the uncertainty had always haunted her. Now there was certainty. Now there would be justice. She gave a statement to reporters. "My father was a man of integrity who died because he refused to look away from wrongdoing. The arrest of Harold Griggs doesn't bring my father back, but it honors his memory and his principles. Truth and justice mattered to him, and today they're being served." For James Mitchell, the arrest detonated something deep inside him. He'd spent 20 years convinced that justice was impossible, that his father's disappearance would never be solved, that the universe was fundamentally unjust. He'd built an entire worldview around that bitterness. And now, in a single morning, that foundation had cracked. James took emergency leave from his job in Atlanta and drove immediately to Chattanooga. He went first to the police station, where Detective Chun briefed him on the evidence, the investigation, the timeline. Hearing the details, how his father had been killed, how the body had been buried on church property, how 2 men he'd seen at church services for years had been responsible, was almost too much to process. But Chun also told him about the journal, about his father's final entries. James read them, his father's handwriting preserved after 20 years underground, and something shifted. His father had faced danger knowing the risk, had chosen truth over safety, had extended grace even to someone who was stealing from him. David Mitchell had died living out his principles, and that realization hit James like a physical blow. That evening, James did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He went to Riverside Baptist Church. Not for a service, the building was empty, locked. But he stood in the parking lot where his father's car had been found, looked at the church offices where his father had last been seen alive, walked toward the property line where construction workers had discovered the buried grave, and James wept, not just for his father, but for the 20 years he'd spent consumed by bitterness, by anger at God, by cynicism about justice and faith. His father had died believing in truth, in accountability, in redemption. And his father had been right. The truth had come out. Justice was being served. It had taken 20 years, but David Mitchell's faith in a moral universe had been vindicated. Meanwhile, Thomas Keller's arrest had occurred simultaneously at his residence across town. Unlike Harold, Keller had expected it. He'd been cooperating with investigators for weeks, had negotiated a plea agreement in exchange for testimony. When officers arrived to formally place him under arrest, Keller went quietly, almost with relief. The secret that had poisoned his life for 20 years was finally out. The consequences he'd feared for so long were finally here. And in a strange way that brought peace. Keller's family was devastated. His wife of 57 years, who'd known nothing about his involvement in David's death, felt her entire marriage had been built on a lie. His children and grandchildren struggled to reconcile the grandfather they loved with the man who'd helped bury a pastor and hide the crime for decades. Some forgave him, understanding that he'd been caught in an impossible situation and had finally done the right thing by confessing. Others cut contact, unable to accept what he'd done. The contrast between Harold's silence and Keller's cooperation would become a major point during the trial. One man clinging to denial, one man seeking redemption through truth. One man forcing the system to prove every element, one man taking responsibility and helping bring justice. The legal outcomes for both would reflect those different choices. As November moved forward and both men awaited trial, Chattanooga wrestled with the implications of the case. How had a murder occurred in a church building and gone undetected for 20 years? How had financial crimes happened under the watch of a church board? How had two respected community members hidden such a terrible secret for so long? The case forced uncomfortable conversations about institutional accountability, about the trust placed in religious leaders, about how evil can hide behind respectability and piety. But amid the darkness, there was also light. A cold case had been solved. A family finally had answers. A victim's voice, preserved in his own words in a buried journal, had spoken from the grave to identify his killers. And the justice system, however slowly, however imperfectly, was working to hold those killers accountable. The arrest was just the beginning. The trial would bring the full story to light, would force Harold Griggs to face what he'd done, would give the Mitchell family their day in court. Justice was coming, delayed but not defeated. March 18, 2025. The trial of Harold Griggs began in Hamilton County Criminal Court, Judge Margaret Reynolds presiding. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Reporters, community members, church congregants, everyone who could get a seat crammed into the gallery. This wasn't just a murder trial. It was the culmination of a 20-year mystery, a reckoning for a crime that had haunted an entire city. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Marcus Thompson, a veteran prosecutor with a reputation for meticulous preparation and powerful closing arguments. Thompson's opening statement laid out the case with devastating clarity. Harold Griggs embezzled church funds, David Mitchell discovered the theft, confronted Harold, and was murdered to silence him. The burial, the cover-up, the 20 years of deception. All would be proven through physical evidence, forensic analysis, and the testimony of Harold's co-conspirator. The defense, led by attorney Richard Carlson, faced an uphill battle. Carlson's opening statement argued that the prosecution's case relied too heavily on the testimony of Thomas Keller, a confessed accomplice with every reason to lie and shift blame. Yes, money was missing. Yes, David Mitchell had disappeared. But that didn't prove Harold Griggs killed him. The defense would show reasonable doubt, would highlight gaps in the evidence, would argue that without eyewitnesses to the actual murder, the case was circumstantial. The prosecution's first witness was Patricia Mitchell. Now 70 years old, still sharp and composed despite decades of grief. Patricia walked the jury through her life with David, his character, his work at the church, the day he disappeared. She described the 20 years of not knowing, of hoping he'd come home, of being unable to move forward or find closure. Her testimony wasn't legally crucial. It established victim impact and humanized David, but it was emotionally powerful. Several jurors were visibly affected. Next came James Mitchell. He described his father's dedication to truth and justice, the impact of his disappearance on the family, his own loss of faith and descent into bitterness. He spoke about reading his father's journal entries for the first time and understanding that David had died living out his principles. James's testimony established the journal's authenticity. He confirmed his father's handwriting, confirmed details about church finances that only someone close to the situation would know. Then the prosecution called Detective Sarah Chin. She walked the jury through the discovery of the burial site, the excavation, the forensic analysis of the remains. She described finding David's Bible, his robe, his journal. She explained how modern forensic techniques allowed them to recover fingerprints from the storage container and how those prints matched Harold Griggs. She detailed the credit card records showing Harold's purchase of burial supplies the day after David disappeared. Chen's testimony took an entire day, methodically building the physical evidence case. The defense tried to poke holes, question chain of custody, questioned whether 20-year-old fingerprints were reliable, suggested alternative explanations for the credit card purchases. But Chen was well prepared, her answers precise and documented. The evidence stood firm. Day 3 brought the prosecution's most anticipated witness, Thomas Keller. Now 79, frail and clearly burdened by guilt, Keller took the stand and told the jury everything. He described his friendship with Harold, the panicked phone call on the night of October 13th, arriving at the church to find David's body, the decision to help cover it up. He walked through the burial process step by step, wrapping the body, digging the grave, concealing evidence, cleaning the crime scene. Keller's testimony was devastating in its detail. He knew things only someone who'd been there could know: the specific location of the burial, the size and depth of the grave, the condition of David's body, what items were buried separately. His account matched physical evidence perfectly. And crucially, Keller expressed genuine remorse. He spoke directly to Patricia and James, tears streaming down his face, and apologized for the pain he'd caused, for the cowardice that led him to help hide the truth for 20 years. The defense attacked Keller aggressively during cross-examination. They highlighted his plea deal, suggested he was lying to get a reduced sentence, pointed out inconsistencies in his statements over multiple interviews. They painted him as the real killer trying to frame Harold. But Keller held firm. His story never wavered, and the physical evidence corroborated every major point he made. The prosecution then brought in expert witnesses. A forensic anthropologist explained the skeletal analysis, describing the blunt force trauma injuries and what they revealed about the murder weapon. A forensic accountant walked through Harold's embezzlement scheme, showing fake invoices and fraudulent transfers totaling $140,000. A digital forensics expert testified about recovering Harold's draft email confession from ancient server backups. Each expert witness added another layer to the case. The defense tried to suggest alternative interpretations. Maybe the skull fractures came from something other than murder, maybe the financial irregularities were accounting errors, maybe the email was taken out of context. But the experts held their ground. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly to intentional murder and deliberate cover-up. Perhaps the most powerful moment came when the prosecution read portions of David Mitchell's journal aloud in court. The courtroom fell completely silent as David's own words described discovering the embezzlement, confronting Harold, planning the final meeting where he'd offer Harold a chance to confess. David's voice, preserved through his writing, spoke from beyond the grave to identify his killer. Meeting with Harold tomorrow evening after service. Going to give him chance to explain, to make things right before I go to police. Praying for his soul. The next day, David had been murdered. The timeline was impossible to ignore. The prosecution rested after 8 days of testimony. The defense case was much shorter. Carlson called character witnesses who described Harold as a devoted church member, a trustworthy leader, someone incapable of violence. They testified that he'd never shown any signs of guilt or instability in the 20 years since David's disappearance. How could someone carry such a secret without showing any outward sign? But the prosecution's rebuttal witnesses countered effectively. Mental health experts testified that it's entirely possible for someone to compartmentalize trauma and guilt, to present a normal exterior while hiding terrible secrets. Criminals do it all the time. and Harold had strong motivation to maintain appearances. Showing guilt or distress would have invited suspicion. The defense also called an independent forensic expert who suggested the fingerprints on the storage container might have gotten there through innocent contact before the murder. Maybe Harold had borrowed the container for some legitimate purpose. But under cross-examination, this expert admitted it was unlikely given the location of the prints and the timing of the purchase. Carlson's closing argument was passionate but defensive. He argued that the prosecution had shown Harold had motive and opportunity, but hadn't definitively proven he'd actually committed murder. Thomas Keller's testimony was self-serving. The physical evidence was circumstantial. The email was ambiguous. Unless the jury was certain beyond a reasonable doubt, and how could they be certain without an eyewitness or a confession, they had to acquit. But Marcus Thompson's closing argument was devastating. He walked through the evidence piece by piece, showing how every element fit together. The embezzlement gave motive. The journal showed confrontation. The credit card records showed preparation. The burial location showed opportunity. Keller's testimony showed method. The draft email showed consciousness of guilt. And most importantly, David Mitchell's own words, written in the days before he died, pointed directly at Harold Griggs. "David Mitchell told us who killed him," Thompson said, holding up the journal. "He documented it, preserved it, and 20 years later, his voice finally reached us. Harold Griggs murdered him to hide theft from a church, from people who trusted him, from God himself according to David's beliefs. He buried this good man like trash and went on with his life for 2 decades. The evidence is overwhelming. The defendant is guilty, and it's time for justice." The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. It was a complex case with volumes of evidence, and they took their responsibility seriously. But on March 28, 2025, they returned with their verdict. The courtroom rose as Judge Reynolds returned to the bench. Harold Griggs stood with his attorneys, his face pale but expressionless. Patricia, James, and Melissa Mitchell sat in the front row holding hands. The forewoman of the jury stood. "On the count of first-degree murder, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, Harold Griggs, guilty." The courtroom erupted. Some gasped, some wept, some shouted in triumph. Judge Reynolds gavelled for order. Patricia Mitchell collapsed into James's arms. 20 years of grief and hope and pain released in a single moment. Justice. Finally, justice. The jury also found Harold guilty on all other charges: conspiracy, abuse of a corpse, obstruction of justice. The embezzlement charges, tried separately, would also result in convictions. Harold Griggs, at 83 years old, had been found guilty of murdering David Mitchell and covering it up for 20 years. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read. No tears, no outburst, no last-minute confession. Just silence. The same silence he'd maintained for 2 decades while a family suffered without answers. It was a silence he'd carry with him to prison, and eventually to his grave. Sentencing was scheduled for April 15, 2025. Under Tennessee law, first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison. The only question was whether Harold would be eligible for parole, and given his age and the circumstances, that was unlikely. But the sentencing hearing was crucial for another reason: victim impact statements. This was the Mitchell family's opportunity to address Harold directly, to speak to the man who'd stolen 20 years from them. The courtroom was again packed as Judge Reynolds called the hearing to order. Harold Griggs sat at the defense table, looking diminished and frail, a stark contrast to the respected church leader he'd once presented himself as. His attorneys had filed motions for leniency based on his age and health, arguing that spending his final years in prison served no purpose. The prosecution had filed opposing briefs arguing that the calculated nature of the crime and the 2 decades of deception warranted the maximum possible sentence. But before Judge Reynolds would rule, the Mitchell family would have their say. Patricia Mitchell approached the podium first. At 70 years old, she still carried herself with dignity, though the years of grief had clearly taken their toll. She didn't look at Harold as she spoke. She addressed her words to the judge, to the courtroom, to anyone who would listen, but she couldn't bring herself to make eye contact with the man who'd murdered her husband. "Your Honor, members of the court," For 20 years I've waited to stand in this moment. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted truth. David always said that truth was sacred, that it mattered more than comfort or convenience, that God's justice would always prevail even if human justice failed. I held on to that belief even when it seemed impossible. Harold Griggs took my husband from me. He took my children's father. He took a mentor and friend from hundreds of people who looked up to David. But more than that, he stole 20 years of our lives. 20 years of not knowing, of hoping, of wondering if we'd ever get answers. 20 years of seeing David's empty chair at every birthday, every Christmas, every anniversary. 20 years of prayers that went seemingly unanswered. I forgave Harold years ago, not because he deserved it, but because carrying that hatred was destroying me. But forgiveness doesn't mean freedom from consequences. David died because he refused to let wrongdoing stand unchallenged. He died living out his principles. The least we can do is ensure that his death brings accountability and justice. Patricia paused, finally turning to look directly at Harold. Her voice didn't waver. I pray for your soul, Harold. I pray that you find genuine repentance before you stand before God. Because ultimately, the judgment that matters most isn't happening in this courtroom. David would have wanted me to say that. He'd have wanted me to offer grace even now. So I do. But I also ask this court to impose the fullest sentence possible under the law. James Mitchell was next. He approached the podium with visible tension, his hands gripping the sides tightly. Unlike his mother, James stared directly at Harold from the moment he started speaking. Mr. Griggs, look at me. His voice was firm, commanding. Harold slowly raised his eyes. For 20 years, I hated God because of what you did. I walked away from everything my father believed in because I couldn't understand how a just God would let him vanish without trace or reason. I built my entire worldview around the idea that the universe was fundamentally unfair, that good people weren't protected, that faith was meaningless. You didn't just kill my father. You killed my faith. You killed my relationship with my sister because I was too bitter to be around. You killed my mother's peace. You killed the future my father should have had with his grandchildren. The ripples from your actions destroyed more than you could possibly comprehend. But here's what I've learned through this process. My father was right. Truth does matter. Justice, even delayed, is still justice. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it does bend toward justice. You proved him right by getting caught, by being here, by facing consequences you thought you'd escaped. I still struggle with faith. I don't know if I'll ever set foot in a church again. But I've learned to respect what my father believed, to honor his memory by caring about truth the way he did. You tried to bury him, to erase him, to win by outlasting the investigation. You failed. He won. Truth won. And I hope you spend every remaining day of your life understanding that. Melissa was last. She was calmer than James, but her words carried their own weight. I was 16 when you took my father. I'm 38 now. More than half my life has been spent without him. I got married without him walking me down the aisle. My children have grown up hearing stories about a grandfather they'll never meet. Every milestone, every achievement, every moment I wanted to share with him, gone. But you know what hurts most? You sat in church pews for years after killing him. You sang hymns standing on his grave. You collected offering money that helped pay for his memorial service. You looked my mother in the eye at church functions and expressed condolences while knowing exactly what happened to him. That calculated cruelty is what I can't forgive. I hope prison gives you time to think about what you've done, to feel the weight of it. Not for my sake. I found my own peace. But for your sake. Because if there's any truth to what my father believed, you'll answer for this beyond these courtroom walls. And that judgment will be far more severe than anything this court can impose. The victim impact statements concluded. Harold's attorneys made a brief plea for leniency that fell flat given what the court had just heard. Then Judge Reynolds addressed the courtroom. Mr. Griggs, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of first-degree murder, conspiracy, abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. The evidence presented at trial showed a crime of calculated cruelty. Not a moment of passion, but a deliberate choice to silence someone who threatened to expose your theft. You then spent 20 years allowing David Mitchell's family to suffer without answers while you continued to present yourself as a faithful church member. This court has presided over many difficult cases, but few have demonstrated such sustained deception and callousness. You had opportunities to confess, to seek redemption, to end the suffering of people who deserve truth. You chose silence instead. On the charge of first-degree murder, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the remaining charges, I impose maximum consecutive sentences. You will spend whatever time remains to you in custody, and you will die in prison. That is the consequence of your choices. Harold Griggs was 83 years old. Life in prison meant exactly what it sounded like. He would never walk free again. He'd die behind bars, his final years marked by the justice he'd tried to escape for 2 decades. Thomas Keller, having cooperated and shown genuine remorse, received a different sentence. He pleaded guilty to accessory to murder after the fact and obstruction of justice. In exchange for his testimony, he was sentenced to 15 years with possibility of parole after 10. At 79, he'd likely die in prison as well, but his cooperation and remorse earned him consideration that Harold's silence didn't. As Harold was led from the courtroom in shackles, Patricia, James, and Melissa embraced. They'd done it. After 20 years, they'd gotten justice for David. It didn't bring him back. It didn't erase the pain, but it honored his memory and validated his faith in truth and accountability. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. James gave a brief statement. "Justice delayed is still justice. My father believed in truth, and today truth prevailed. We're grateful to Detective Chun, to the prosecution team, to everyone who worked to solve this case. Our family can finally begin real healing." The cold case that had haunted Chattanooga for 20 years was finally, definitively closed. The pastor who'd vanished without a trace had been found. His killers had been identified, tried, and convicted. Justice had been served. The David Mitchell case didn't end with Harold Griggs's sentencing. Its impact rippled outward, touching the justice system, the church community, and cold case investigations across the country. This was more than just another solved mystery. It became a landmark case that changed how people thought about cold cases, institutional accountability, and the long arc of justice. First, the investigative techniques. The Mitchell case demonstrated the power of modern forensics applied to decades-old evidence. The ability to recover fingerprints from 20-year-old plastic, to extract DNA from skeletal remains, to enhance water-damaged documents using new imaging techniques, to pull deleted emails from ancient server backups. All of this showed that time doesn't necessarily erase evidence. Cold cases that seemed unsolvable 10 or 20 years ago might be crackable now with technology and methods that didn't exist when the crimes occurred. Detective Sarah Chun became a leading voice in cold case advocacy, speaking at law enforcement conferences about the Mitchell investigation. Her message was clear. Never assume a case is too old to solve. Re-examine cold case files with modern tools. The evidence is often still there, waiting for the right technology to unlock it. Within a year of the Mitchell verdict, the Chattanooga Police Department secured funding for a dedicated cold case unit with 3 full-time detectives and access to state-of-the-art forensic resources. Second, the institutional changes within religious organizations. The Mitchell case exposed how easily financial crimes can occur in churches and nonprofits when proper oversight is lacking. Riverside Baptist Church, in the aftermath of the scandal, implemented comprehensive financial reforms. Independent external audits, mandatory rotation of financial positions, board oversight requirements, transparent reporting to congregation members. These reforms became a model that churches across Tennessee and beyond adopted. The Tennessee Council of Churches issued new guidelines for financial accountability in member organizations. Banks that handled church accounts implemented new fraud detection systems. The case became a cautionary tale taught in seminary classes about the importance of transparency and accountability, even among trusted leaders. David Mitchell's death, tragic as it was, sparked reforms that would protect countless other organizations from similar crimes. Third, the impact on other families with missing loved ones. The Mitchell case gave hope to families across the country who'd been waiting years or decades for answers. If David's disappearance could be solved after 20 years, if justice could still be achieved even when all seemed lost, then maybe other cold cases could be cracked too. Law enforcement agencies reported increases in families reaching out to request that old missing person cases be re-examined. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Persons featured David's case in educational materials about never giving up hope, about the importance of preserving evidence, about how modern technology creates new possibilities for solving old mysteries. Patricia Mitchell became an advocate for cold case families, offering support and encouragement to others walking the painful path she'd walked for 2 decades. The personal impacts were equally profound. James Mitchell's journey was perhaps the most dramatic. The son who'd abandoned faith entirely, who'd spent 20 years consumed by bitterness, began a slow, difficult process of reconciliation with his father's legacy. He didn't suddenly become religious. The wounds were too deep for that, but he found a way to honor his father's memory without anger. James started volunteering with the Tennessee Cold Case Foundation, using his social work background to support families of missing persons. He couldn't bring himself to pray like his father had, but he could serve people the way his father had. And in that service, he found something resembling peace. His relationship with his sister improved. He reconnected with his mother in deeper ways. The hardness that had defined him for 20 years began to soften. In an interview 2 years after the verdict, James reflected, "I don't know if I'll ever have faith in God again. That's something I'm still working through. But I have faith in truth now. I have faith that justice, even delayed, matters. My father was right about that. He was right to pursue truth even when it cost him everything. That's the legacy I'm trying to honor." Patricia Mitchell lived to see justice served, but she passed away in 2027, just 2 years after Harold's conviction. She died peacefully, surrounded by family, in the same house she'd shared with David. At her funeral, the pastor noted that Patricia had finally been able to properly grieve her husband once she knew what happened to him. The knowing, painful as it was, had brought a kind of closure that allowed her to let go. Melissa continued to live in Chattanooga, raising her family, staying connected to Riverside Baptist Church. She became involved in church governance, serving on the Financial Oversight Committee to ensure the reforms put in place after the scandal remained effective. She wanted her children to grow up understanding that faith communities, like all human institutions, need accountability and transparency. That was the lesson her father had died teaching. For the broader Chattanooga community, the case became a defining story, a reminder that evil can hide behind respectability, that trust must be earned and verified, that justice sometimes takes longer than we'd like but can still prevail. The new East Lake Community and Wellness Center, built on the property where David's body was found, was renamed the David Mitchell Community Center. A plaque near the entrance tells his story and honors his commitment to truth and service. The legal community watched the case closely because it demonstrated how accomplice testimony, when properly corroborated by physical evidence, can secure convictions even decades after a crime. Thomas Keller's cooperation was crucial, but it was the physical evidence, the fingerprints, the credit card records, the journal, the draft email, that made the case unassailable. Defense attorneys across the country studied the trial, learning from Richard Carlson's unsuccessful strategies. Prosecutors studied Marcus Thompson's approach as a template for how to try cold cases effectively. The case also sparked discussions about when accomplices deserve leniency in exchange for cooperation. Keller had helped bury a body, had concealed a murder for 20 years, yet received a relatively lenient sentence because he eventually told the truth. Some victim advocates argued he'd gotten off too easy. Others pointed out that without his testimony, Harold Griggs might never have been convicted. It was a complex moral question with no easy answer. Harold Griggs himself became a case study in criminal psychology. How does someone commit murder, bury the victim, and then continue normal life for 20 years? Forensic psychologists analyzed his capacity for compartmentalization, his apparent lack of conscience, his ability to maintain a facade of piety while living with terrible guilt. Some suggested he was a sociopath who felt no real remorse. Others believed he felt crushing guilt but valued his freedom more than truth. He never spoke publicly about his motivations, so the psychological analysis remained speculative. What wasn't speculative was the impact his actions had on discussions about trust and accountability in institutional settings. The Mitchell case became a teaching tool in ethics classes, in leadership seminars, in organizational management courses. How do you balance trust with accountability? How do you create systems that prevent abuse without assuming everyone is corrupt? How do you respond when someone you trusted deeply violates that trust? These weren't abstract questions. David Mitchell had died because he sought answers to them. Perhaps the most profound impact was on how people thought about cold cases themselves. The term cold case implies something frozen, dead, unsolvable. But the Mitchell case showed that cold doesn't mean closed. Evidence persists. Technology advances. People's consciences weigh on them. New witnesses emerge. Construction projects unearth buried secrets. The passage of time doesn't grant immunity to criminals. Sometimes it just means justice takes longer to arrive. Law enforcement agencies across the country reported renewed public interest in cold cases after the Mitchell verdict. Tips started flowing in on old cases. People came forward with information they'd withheld for years. The message was clear. It's never too late to tell the truth. It's never too late for justice. The Mitchell family established the David Mitchell Truth and Justice Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting cold case investigations and helping families of long-term missing persons. They raised funds for forensic testing, advocated for legislative changes to allocate more resources to cold cases, and provided emotional support to families waiting for answers just like they had waited. The foundation's tagline, drawn from one of David's sermons, became widely recognized. Truth is patient. Justice is persistent. Those words, spoken by a pastor who died pursuing truth, became a rallying cry for everyone committed to solving cold cases and holding criminals accountable no matter how much time had passed. 20 years of darkness ended with light. 20 years of silence ended with truth. 20 years of injustice ended with accountability. The cold case that haunted Chattanooga was solved not because investigators gave up, but because they never stopped believing that the truth mattered and that justice, even delayed, was worth pursuing. David Mitchell's story became proof that cold cases can be solved, that patience and persistence pay off, that modern science and old-fashioned determination can overcome decades of concealment and lies. His death had meaning beyond tragedy. It sparked reforms, inspired investigators, gave hope to families, and demonstrated that the arc of the moral universe, however long, really does bend toward justice. As we come to the end of David Mitchell's story, I want us to sit with what we've learned, not just about this case, but about the nature of truth and justice and how they persist even in the darkest circumstances. David Mitchell was 42 years old when he died. He had years ahead of him, grandchildren he'd never meet, sermons he'd never preach, lives he'd never touch. Harold Griggs took all of that away for $47,000 and the preservation of his own reputation. Think about that calculation. A man's life, a family's peace, a community's trust, all sacrificed to hide theft and avoid accountability. But here's what Harold couldn't take. He couldn't take away David's character, his principles, his faith that truth would prevail. David documented what he found. He confronted wrongdoing even knowing the risk. He offered grace and opportunity for redemption right up until the moment he was killed. And his words, buried with his body, waited 20 years to speak again and bring justice. There are lessons here for all of us. First, that evil often hides behind respectability, trust, and institutional authority. Harold Griggs was a deacon, a respected community member, someone trusted with church finances. That trust became a shield that allowed him to steal and eventually to kill. We have to create systems of accountability that don't rely solely on trusting people to do right, because sometimes they don't. Second, that truth has remarkable persistence. David's journal survived burial. Fingerprints survived 20 years underground. Digital records survived server migrations and technological changes. The evidence remained, waiting for the right combination of circumstances and technology to bring it to light. If you're sitting on information about a crime, even an old crime, it's never too late to come forward. The truth wants to be known. Third, that justice delayed is not the same as justice denied. 20 years feels like forever when you're waiting. Patricia Mitchell spent 2 decades wondering if she'd ever know what happened to her husband. James Mitchell spent 20 years convinced justice was impossible. But they were wrong. Justice came. Came slowly, imperfectly, but it came. And that should give hope to every family waiting for answers about their missing loved ones. I think about the families of missing persons all the time in this line of work. Thousands of cases remain unsolved across this country. Thousands of families live in the limbo that the Mitchells lived in for 20 years. They don't know if their loved one is alive somewhere, dead, suffering, at peace. They can't grieve properly because there's no confirmation. They can't move forward because there's no closure. If you're part of one of those families, if you're waiting for answers about someone who vanished, David Mitchell's story should tell you this. Don't give up. Keep pushing for investigation. Keep asking questions. Keep preserving evidence and information. Technology improves every year. Forensic techniques advance. People's consciences catch up with them. Construction projects unearth buried secrets. Your cold case might be the next one solved. And if you're someone who knows something about an unsolved case, an old disappearance, a covered-up crime, come forward. The guilt and fear you feel carrying that secret will only grow worse with time. Thomas Keller lived with crushing guilt for 20 years, and when he finally told the truth, he described it as a relief despite knowing he'd face prison. Your information could bring closure to a family that desperately needs it. It could bring justice to someone who deserves it. It could honor a victim who's been waiting decades to be found. The David Mitchell case reminds us that cold cases aren't abstract puzzles. They're human tragedies that echo across years and generations. Every cold case represents a family fractured by loss, a community traumatized by violence, a victim denied justice. When we say we care about justice, when we say we value truth, we have to mean it for the cold cases too, not just the fresh ones, not just the ones that are easy to solve. Law enforcement deserves credit for not giving up. Detective Robert Dawson spent his retirement years thinking about this case. Detective Sarah Chun pursued it with relentless determination once new evidence emerged. Prosecutors Marcus Thompson built an airtight case that honored David's memory and brought accountability. These professionals represent the best of what the justice system can be when it works properly. But we also have to acknowledge the systemic failures. A church board that didn't implement proper financial oversight. An investigation in 2004 that couldn't find evidence that was literally buried on the property. 20 years during which Harold Griggs walked free while the Mitchell family suffered. Justice came eventually, but the delays and oversights represent real failures that we should learn from. David Mitchell believed in truth, in accountability, in redemption through confession and repentance. He died living those values, offering Harold Griggs a chance to make things right even as he prepared to hold him accountable. That grace-filled approach to justice, firm but merciful, uncompromising on truth but generous in offering paths to redemption, is worth emulating. We live in a world that often feels fundamentally unjust, where bad people seem to win and good people suffer. The Mitchell case, as painful as it is, stands against that cynicism. It proves that truth persists, that evidence can survive, that justice can prevail even when all hope seems lost. David was right. His son James had to relearn the lesson, but he eventually got there. The moral arc is long, but it does bend toward justice. So as I close this story, I want to leave you with David Mitchell's own words, the last entry in his journal before he died. Praying for his soul. If he's stealing from church, he's stealing from God, and the consequences will be devastating. But giving him opportunity to confess and repent, that's what Christ would do. David faced his killer with grace, offering redemption even while pursuing justice. He died faithful to his principles. And 20 years later, his words brought down the man who murdered him. Truth won. Justice prevailed. And a cold case that seemed unsolvable became a testament to the power of persistence, modern forensics, and one man's unshakable commitment to doing right. If you have information about an unsolved case, a missing person, a covered-up crime, make the call. Reach out to law enforcement. Contact the families. Your tip could be the one that finally brings someone home. Your information could provide closure to people who've waited decades for answers. Your courage to speak up could be what tips a cold case from unsolved to justice served. And for those waiting for answers about loved ones, keep hope alive. Keep pressing for investigation. Keep believing that truth matters and justice, even delayed, is possible. David Mitchell's family waited 20 years, but they got their answers. Your day might be coming too. With that said, thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for caring about cold cases, about truth, about justice for all victims no matter how long ago their cases went cold. Until next time, remember, every cold case is a story waiting to be told, a family waiting for peace, and a victim waiting for justice. Let's keep telling those stories and pursuing that justice.